Czechoslovakia are European champions.
50 years ago, Czechoslovakia stood on top of European football, having defeated reigning world champions West Germany in the final of UEFA Euro 1976. Less than 20 years later, that country had ceased to exist. This is their story. Our beginning takes us to the year of 1918. For centuries prior, the lands of the Czechs and Slovaks were not independent at all, instead being a part of the greater Austro-Hungarian Empire. However, following the Central Powers' defeat to the Allied powers in the First World War, that empire had disintegrated and dissolved. From this, an independent Czechoslovak state was declared by Tomáš Masaryk, who would become the nation's first president, and Edvard Beneš, who would become the nation's second president. They had argued that a united Czechoslovakian state would be a stable democracy which could act as a buffer between Germany and Russia, and crucially that the Czechs and Slovaks were branches of the same tree, sharing similar languages and cultures. The Allied powers were convinced and quickly moved to recognise the new state as legitimate. And within 1 year of their foundation as a newly created nation, Czechoslovakia would find themselves at their first international football tournament. The Inter-Allied Games was a one-off multi-sport event in the summer of 1919, organised by the United States military in celebration of the Allied victory in World War I. In the tournament, 8 nations would be split into 2 groups of 4, with the 2 nations to finish in top spot meeting in a final to ultimately decide the victors. Czechoslovakia were drawn into Group 2 alongside Belgium, the United States and Canada. The newly formed states would show their levels from the off in this tournament, defeating all 3 of their group opponents by beating Belgium 4-1, the United States 8-2 and Canada 3-2 to send themselves into the final. There they would meet the tournament hosts of France, who themselves had dominated their group, scoring 17 goals and conceding 0. In the final, in front of 25,000 spectators, France would find themselves 2-0 ahead with 30 minutes on the clock, before Czechoslovakia pulled a goal back just before half time. In the second half, the Czechoslovakian side would make a tactical tweak to move star striker Antonín Janda further forward, a move that would ultimately prove pivotal as he notched another 2 goals to add to the 5 he'd scored in the groups to complete a remarkable comeback victory for his new nation. An excerpt from a Belgian newspaper shortly after the final would detail how US soldiers, who had been so impressed with Czechoslovak forward Antonín Janda, stormed the pitch at full time to carry him off the field on their shoulders. In all, it showed the potential of the Czechoslovakian national team, whose existence wasn't even a year old at this point. A year later, Czechoslovakia headed to the Summer Olympics to compete in their first officially recognised tournament. Poetically, the first round would see Czechoslovakia matched up with another nation that had been formed following the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which was the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats and Slovenes, which was a precursor to the later named Kingdom of Yugoslavia. Here though, the Central Europeans would be far too strong for their breakaway counterparts, with that man Janda picking up a hat-trick in a 7-0 victory. Norway would follow in the quarter-finals, where Janda scored a triple once again to send his nation into the last 4, where they would face their finalists from the previous year in France. Here, a far wider scoreline would be achieved for Czechoslovakia as they blew past the French in a 4-1 victory, meaning for the second time in 2 years since formation, the newly created nation were heading for the final. Here, for a chance at Olympic gold, they were up against the hosts of Belgium in a match that has gone down in infamy. As 50,000 people entered the stadium in Antwerp, they could surely not have foreseen the scenes that would take place before the first half had finished. Even before kick-off, the Belgian crowd were baying for what they saw as revenge against one of the nations that they believed had started World War I, a belief which wasn't true. In just the 6th minute, Belgium would be awarded a penalty amidst a backdrop of excessive protests from Czechoslovakian players who believed their goalkeeper had been fouled in the build-up. The penalty would nonetheless be converted and a second Belgian goal would be found on the half-hour mark. The visitors though had fully lost their cool, and when defender Karol Steiner was sent off for a foul on the penalty goalscorer Robert Kope just before the interval, Czechoslovakian captain Karel Pešek took the decision to lead his team off the pitch in protest. The referee would ultimately abandon the match, which enraged the majority Belgian crowd, who took to the pitch to attack the protesting players, who had to be protected by the military. Ultimately, Belgium would win the gold medal, with the spectators pulling down the flag of their opponents during the medal ceremony. The International Olympic Committee would take the decision to strip Czechoslovakia of their silver medal in controversial circumstances, and is still debated today by the ethics of that resolution. The nation would be back 4 years later to right their wrongs at the 1924 Paris Olympics. However, the form that had seen them become immediate contenders had passed. Many of the great early players had stopped playing, and here they could only manage a second round exit, falling to Switzerland 1-0 in a replay. Instead, it would take until 1934 before they could compete again at an international tournament, as they headed for their first ever FIFA World Cup. Now at this point in history, the Czechoslovakian promises of stability and democracy, if they were to be given their own state, had been well and truly kept. The nation had become industrially advanced, and generally tensions between the two major ethnic groups were limited. However, with Adolf Hitler coming to power in Germany and his rhetoric on the Sudetenland area of Czechoslovakia, it was clear that the solid parliamentary state may face challenges it had yet to encounter. Qualification for the tournament would be made relatively easy, having been drawn to face Poland, whom they beat 2-1 in the away leg, before Poland prevented its national team from travelling to Czechoslovakia due to political tensions between the two nations on issues of sovereignty and territory. As such, they were heading to Rome to compete in the expanded 16-team FIFA World Cup for the first time in their history. At the tournament, Czechoslovakia would find themselves seeded for their opening round of 16 match, as they were drawn against Romania in Trieste, Italy. They would go in as major favourites, but found themselves 1-0 down just 10 minutes in. Though having done so, a second half revival would be found as they turned the score on its head to win 2-1. The quarterfinals would see them head for Turin as they took on Switzerland. Once again here, Czechoslovakia would find themselves 1-0 behind early on, but recovered quickly to level the match before half time. The second half would see the Swiss dominate possession, but the firepower of Oldrich Neschli, who was making an astounding impact at this tournament, would find the winning goal 8 minutes from time in a 3-2 victory. In the semi-final they would face Germany, and for all the unease politically, it certainly hadn't translated onto the football pitch. This match would prove to be Czechoslovakia's finest hour up until this point. Neschli would fire off an impressive hat-trick as they defeated their neighbours by 3-1, and crucially had just made the final at their first ever FIFA World Cup. Now, the overarching narrative of this tournament was that Italian leader Benito Mussolini was using the World Cup as a propaganda tool, and as such there were widespread suspicion that officiating had been biased in their favour at this tournament. However, in the final it was less contentious. Antonín Puč opened the scoring for the outsiders, but the hosts would turn victory around with an equaliser 10 minutes from time, and a winner would be found in extra time. Once again, the final hurdle had been a jump too far for Czechoslovakia, but still, given it was their first appearance at the tournament, they could take great pride in their runners-up medal. 4 years later, they would be back once again as one of the 16 teams, but this time they would be less fruitful. A 3-0 victory over the Netherlands in extra time would see them advance to the quarterfinals, with Oldrich Neschli back amongst the goals. Here they would be drawn against Brazil in the first meeting between the two sides, in a match that would later be dubbed the Battle of Bordeaux. In terms of the goals, Brazil found a lead 30 minutes in, only for Neschli to equalise from the spot just after the hour mark, as the match ended in a 1-1 draw. Though this was not the major talking point from this match. Zezé would be sent off for Brazil 14 minutes into this match before pandemonium took hold. Fouls, skirmishes, brawls broke out all over the field, resulting in a second Brazilian, Arthur Mercado, being sent off, and Czechoslovak player Jan Čiha also being dismissed. Brazil's goalscorer Leonidis would be subbed off with an injury shortly into the second half, before two Czechoslovak players, goalkeeper Franky Czech Planička and goalscorer Oldrich Nežley, picked up a broken arm and broken leg respectively. Nežley would have to leave the field of players, bringing the teams down to 9 each, while courageously Franky Czech Planička continued playing in net despite a broken arm, in what would turn out to be his 73rd and final cap for his nation. The match would go through to extra time, but with both sets of players battered and exhausted, the match would run out with no further goals, sending the match to a replay 2 days later. Due to the troubling effects of the first match, Brazil had to make 9 changes to their starting 11, whilst Czechoslovakia had to make 5. The Europeans would open the scoring in this one before Brazil levelled the game on the hour mark, yet the controversy still wasn't finished here. Karel Sernetsky believed he had sent his side back in front almost immediately after, but the referee disallowed the goal, stating the ball hadn't crossed the line. Debutant Roberto would find a winner for Brazil soon after, as the Czechoslovaks had to settle with a quarter-final exit. For all the great strides made by Czechoslovakia on the pitch, off it their very survival was at risk. Months after the 1938 World Cup, the Munich Agreement had taken place between Germany, Italy, Britain and France that allowed the Nazis to annex the Sudetenland from Czechoslovakia. In return, Hitler would promise not to make any further territorial demands on Czechoslovak sovereignty. This promise would prove to be worthless. March of the following year would see German forces march into the heart of the Czech lands and turn the regions into the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia. Meanwhile, Slovakia for the first time declared formal independence under Nazi influence, seeing the complete dismantlement of Czechoslovakia as a unified state. It is no secret that Adolf Hitler despised the Czech people, considering them to be Untermenschen, aka subhuman, and the Second World War proved to be a period of enormous and brutal oppression. However, throughout this time, Edvard Beneš, the second president of Czechoslovakia, established a government in exile, which was recognised by the Allies. His hope was always to re-establish the state that he had helped create at the end of the First World War. In May 1945, the US Army had reached the Czech area of Pilsen, and the Soviet Red Army had entered Prague. Beneš would return to preside over Czechoslovakia's rebirth, issuing decrees that saw Germans and Hungarians deported, citizenships revoked, and land confiscated, and these decisions remain contested to this day. Beneš would ultimately not survive as president for long. Communism had gained great popularity in the nation, and a February 1948 coup saw the party seize power with the support of the Soviet Union, ushering in the Czechoslovak Socialist Republic. These events in history had an immediate impact on the state of the national team. With Czechoslovakia now aligned with the Soviet Union, the newly formed Eastern Bloc took the decision to not participate in qualification for the first World Cup since 1938, fearing of letting their athletes travel freely to the West and risking possible defections. Though this would not last long. By the time of qualification for the 1954 World Cup, the communist regimes across the Eastern Bloc had consolidated their power. The fears from 4 years earlier had dissipated and instead saw an opportunity to use sport as a propaganda tool to show international prestige. As such, Czechoslovakia attempted to build on their unassuming rise through tournament football. They would qualify for the 1954 FIFA World Cup in Switzerland, but for the first time in their history, they were heavily defeated. Their 2 matches at the tournament would see them defeated 2-0 by World Cup holders Uruguay and 5-0 by neighbouring Austria. It was clear that both the Second World War and Cold War isolation had seen their nation fall behind the tactical innovations of their opponents. 4 years later would see them return to the World Cup in Sweden. The result didn't see them fare much better, but performances shone a glimmer of hope. Their opening match defeat to debutants Northern Ireland was surprising, but a 2-2 draw with West Germany and a 6-1 drubbing of Argentina showed that they were not remaining whipping boys for long. Unfortunately, a playoff match again with Northern Ireland would see them defeated once again, meaning it was 2 group stage exits in a row. Undoubtedly, it felt harsh to see a team that had drawn with West Germany and beat Argentina 6-1 be eliminated, but it did show that Czechoslovak football was on the rise again. 2 years later would see the creation of a new continental football tournament, the inaugural European Nations Cup, now commonly known as the UEFA European Championships. Czechoslovakia would be one of just 4 teams to qualify for the tournament, having defeated the Republic of Ireland, Denmark and Romania to reach the finals. Here they would find themselves drawn against their Eastern Bloc counterparts the USSR, who themselves were beginning to develop a strong pedigree. With Lev Yashin donning his flat cap in net, it was not too surprising that Czechoslovakia could not find the scoresheet in the semi-final, instead falling to a 3-0 defeat. They would however progress to the 3rd place playoff against the hosts of France, where they would achieve the bronze with a stoic 2-0 victory to bring home another medal. Once more it was clear that Czechoslovakia were making strides in the international scene, and it appeared they had an absolute superstar on their hands. Josef Mazopust was a Czechoslovak midfielder who had shown his acumen at the 1960 Nations Cup, as he was named in the UEFA team of the tournament. By this time he was already a club legend for his side Dukla Prague and had amassed 35 caps with 6 goals by the end of 1960. Yet his finest hour would come 2 years later at the 1962 FIFA World Cup. Czechoslovakia would qualify for the tournament with 3 wins from 4 in their group of themselves, the Republic of Ireland and Scotland. Here they would demonstrate their attacking prowess, with Andrei Kvasniak leading the qualifying goal-scoring charts with 7 goals, with Adolf Scherer just behind on 5. The previous 3 tournaments had overseen steady progress. Annihilated at the 1954 World Cup, bridging the gap at the 1958 World Cup, and a bronze at the 1960 Nations Cup. It was time for Czechoslovakia to resurface themselves as one of the great international challengers as they headed for Chile and the 1962 FIFA World Cup. The South American nation had been majorly impacted by a devastating earthquake just 2 years before the 1962 FIFA World Cup, and conditions would be tough. Czechoslovakia would be drawn into Group 3 alongside Brazil, Mexico and Spain, with their European counterparts first on the agenda. An early goal in this one would prove to be the difference as our highlighted nation took home victory in matchday 1. The defending champions of Brazil would come in their second match, featuring a star-studded lineup including Garrincha and a half-fit Pelé. Here though, Czechoslovakia would be resilient against the frightening attacking prowess of their opponents and secure a 0-0 draw. The final match would see the Europeans face Mexico, who had already been eliminated, having been defeated in their opening 2 matches. Despite Václav Mašek opening the scoring within 15 seconds, Mexico would recover to defeat Czechoslovakia by 3-1. However, with Spain defeated 2-1 by the holders Brazil, a win, draw and loss would be enough to head into the knockout rounds. The quarter-final would see them faced up with Hungary. The neighbouring nation had been a defining force of international football in the 1950s, having been runners-up at the 1954 FIFA World Cup, featuring the leading international goalscorer of the 20th century, Ferenc Puskás. And here they remained a force, topping a group including both Argentina and England and beating Bulgaria 6-1. Though, as in Czechoslovakia's opening match, an early goal would be the difference maker. A defence-splitting ball from Josef Mazopust would tee up Scherer to fire low and hard across the goalkeeper to put his nation ahead. And in spite of Hungarian pressure on the Czechoslovak goal, once more they remained utterly resilient. This would send them through to a semi-final to face Yugoslavia, who had been prolific in the group stage and had taken down West Germany in the quarters. The first half of this second half would see Czechoslovakia largely on the back foot, with bagsman Milan Galic being the danger man. Nevertheless, the score would be tied at 0-0 as half-time rolled around, and soon after the restart in play, a goal would be found. A diving header rebound goal would give Czechoslovakia the slender lead. Goalkeeper William Schroff had been magnificent at the tournament, but a rare error from him allowed Yugoslavia to grab an equaliser. Yet 2 players had been utterly transformative for the Czechoslovaks in the lead up to this tournament. Josef Mazopust had begun to pull the strings, and Adolf Scherer was a born goalscorer, and his late double catapulted Czechoslovakia into their second ever FIFA World Cup final against all the odds. The final would see themselves once again pitted against Brazil. Czechoslovakia had been encouragingly resilient in their group stage meeting, holding the South Americans to a 0-0 draw. They would be further bolstered by the unavailability of starlet Pelé, though their attacking endeavour in both the quarter and semi-finals had seen them yield 7 goals in 2 matches. Czechoslovakia's main man though was Josef Mazopust, one of the best midfielders in football history at this point, and he found the opening goal in this match, latching on to a through ball with a calm finish, and for just a moment Czechoslovakia were on course to be world champions. But unfortunately, I really do mean just a moment, as within 2 minutes Brazil were level, and Marildo's cross-come shot erroneously catching the keeper out at his near post. The second half would see Brazil begin to turn the dial, and they put themselves ahead as Zito arrived at the back post to knock in the second. A third and final settler would be found from a second error from the previously imperious William Schroff, who dropped the cross he came out to claim at the feet of Vava, who passed into the empty net to seal a second consecutive World Cup for Brazil. It just wasn't to be for Czechoslovakia this time around, but reaching the final was undoubtedly a victory in itself. They had rebuilt their pre-war prestige back to being one of the most feared opponents in the international realm. Josef Mazopust would also etch his name in history, as he was named as the 1962 Ballon d'Or winner, emphasising the talent at their disposal. The hope now would be that Czechoslovakia could maintain their standing and continue to challenge. However, that hope would not be fulfilled. The following 12 years would see a sharp decline in results for Czechoslovakia. European Championships of 1964 failed to qualify. 1966 FIFA World Cup failed to qualify. European Championships 1968 failed to qualify. European Championships 1972 failed to qualify. And the 1974 FIFA World Cup failed to qualify. The only anomaly here was the 1970 FIFA World Cup, which Czechoslovakia did qualify for, meeting Brazil once again in the groups alongside England and Romania. The runners-up from 8 years earlier would lose all 3 group matches, conceding 7 goals and having little to cheer about. Thus there was a feeling that their time had been had. Football had moved on, their stars of yesteryear had moved on, but amazingly the best was yet to come. The 1976 European Championships would see Czechoslovakia qualify for the tournament for the second time in impressive fashion, finishing ahead of England and Portugal in their qualifying group before defeating the Soviet Union in the playoffs, to become one of just 4 teams to reach the finals. They would be heading to Yugoslavia to contest for the European Championships crown, a hefty feat given their tournament inexperience in many years. And their semi-final opponents of the Netherlands would hardly make their chances any more favourable. The Dutch had revolutionised football in the early 70s with the innovative Johan Cruyff captaining the side here, 2 years after narrowly being defeated in the 1974 FIFA World Cup final. Yet the physical embodiment of total football could not have started worse when Czechoslovakia took the lead in the early stages of the first half with a delicious header. They would level it up in the second half. The first half goal scorer of Anton Ondrus for Czechoslovakia would end up scoring a second. Unfortunately for him, it was into his own net. This would send the match into extra time, but with the Dutch down to 10 men due to a red card 15 minutes from time, it was the underdogs in the ascension. Their push would yield a second Czechoslovak goal, with talismanic forward Nehoda heading in from close range as the Netherlands' frustration continued. Van Henegem would be the second Dutchman to be dismissed by the referee shortly after, before substitute Vesely rounded the keeper to secure their spot in the final. After over a decade away from the elite, Czechoslovakia was right back amongst it, but they would need all their quality they could find if they were to beat their opponents, the holding European and world champions, West Germany. Franz Beckenbauer was at the heart of the German defence, this match falling on his 100th cap, with Moritz Müller leading the line in his first ever start for his nation, though he had scored a hat-trick off the bench in their semi-final. To be fair to West Germany, they weren't underestimating their opponents like the media were. They knew they were going to have to be at their best to ensure victory. Czechoslovakia had a great knack of starting and ending matches strongly, and this match was no exception. 1-0 up after 8 minutes before doubling it midway through the second half, the later goal proving to be a real pile driver from Karel Dobiasz. Müller though had proven himself to be a real handful, and he swiftly delivered a deficit halver with a sumptuous bicycle kick from close range. The second half saw swaths of German pressure, but an equaliser was not forthcoming. Until the 89th minute, when a corner dropped right on the 6-yard box and Holzenbein was there to head home the leveller, sending the match to extra time. The fatigued men from both sides found themselves tiring, and instead we were heading for the first ever penalty shootout at the European Championships. 7 penalties in, it was Czechoslovakia 4, West Germany 3, with Hernes next to take. He described later how exhausted he was to be stepping up to take a penalty, but decided to hit it with as much force as he could. And to be fair, that's exactly what he did, but in doing so the ball sailed over the bar and wasn't far off clearing the stadium entirely. This left Czechoslovakia just one kick of the ball away from being European champions. Many of their big stars had already been up and scored, so it was left to a man named Antonín Panenka. He ran up to the ball like a cheetah before stopping short just of the ball and chipping it down the middle, completely wrong-footing Sepp Maier in the West Germany net. It was utterly audacious, completely cheeky and simply genius. It is rightly remembered now as one of the most sublime endings to an international final ever seen. Czechoslovakia were therefore European champions. This understated nation who had so often crushed the elite had finally taken it over its final hurdle. 4 years later, they would find themselves on the receiving end of medals once again. They had failed to qualify for the World Cup in '78, but had qualified for both the 1980 Euros and the Olympics later in that summer. West Germany would enact its revenge in the group stage when Czechoslovakia were beaten by them by a 0-0. But our highlighted nation still did enough to finish in second in the expanded 8-team tournament, which sent them through to the 3rd place playoff. Here they would be facing the hosts of Italy, where once again penalties would decide the victor. An almighty 16 penalties were converted, including another from Panenka, who opted not to chip the ball this time, before finally one was saved by the goalie, and once again spot kicks had proven to be a lucky charm for Czechoslovakia, who took home the bronze medal. A month later, the nation would be in the Soviet Union to kickstart their Olympic hopes. With many Western nations boycotting, there was great hope for them to build on their first tournament win 4 years earlier. Here they would bundle past both Cuba and Yugoslavia without conceding a goal to reach the final, this time against the other half of Deutschland, East Germany. A 70,000 strong crowd were in attendance in Moscow as Czechoslovakia picked up their second major title with a late winner. This victory though would be their final imprint on tournament success. Czechoslovakia would be present at both Spain 82, where they were knocked out in the group stage, and Italia 90, where they were competitive, reaching the last 8 before bailing out against the ever scornful West Germany. As for the European Championships, they would never qualify again after 1980. Away from football, the Czechoslovakian communist government was coming under more scrutiny from its people regarding its desire for a return to democracy and away from the uniparty system. By late 1989, this had reached breaking point. The Velvet Revolution saw mass demonstrations against the government, and an 11-day protest coupled with strikes saw the Communist Party reluctantly relinquish power and a parliamentary republic would take shape. The outcome of this saw differing parties elected in the Czech side compared to the Slovak side, and maintaining the combined state was growing less united in government quickly. By 1992, the Slovak parliament had adopted the Declaration of Independence of the Slovak nation. 6 days later, the Czech side would agree to secede Czechoslovakia into 2 separate states. Unlike the divorces of Yugoslavia and the Soviet Union, there was no bloodshed, no violence, just a simple parting of ways, and thus the term Velvet was adopted due to the peaceful nature of both the protests and the dissolution. It's worth noting that many Czechs and Slovaks did not support the breakup of the unified state, but regardless, the internal politics had proven to be detrimental to governing effectively. Thus the national team, which had punched above its weight so often throughout its near 75-year history, was over. They did continue to play together throughout 1993, hoping to qualify for the 1994 FIFA World Cup. But they finished just outside the qualification places after finishing with a goalless draw away to Belgium. The impact of this short-lived nation was certainly not insignificant though. Sure, it pales in comparison to how people remember Yugoslavia and the Soviet Union, but their combined success in this period compared to how both nations have fared independently speaks volumes on what a successful union this was on the pitch. For now though, thank you for joining me on this exploration through a nation now split in two. If you enjoyed this, let me know below with a like, a subscribe and a comment, and maybe we'll revisit this topic another day. And I will see you in the next one.